So, for tonight, kind of over the course of the week, when I was praying about what tonight's message was going to be about, I was given kind of an obscure thing, or at least what I felt was kind of an obscure topic. But at the same time, it's something that has a consistent, legitimate, and overwhelming effect on how we live and who we are, and especially for Christians in their relationship with God. And that is the concept of sovereignty. See, to be sovereign is possessing supreme or ultimate power. That's the adjective of the word sovereign, according to the Oxford Dictionary. And the thing of it is that when we talk about sovereignty, everybody who's read the Bible or been to church understands that sovereignty is oftentimes applied to God. He is our sovereign Lord. But I don't know that everyone entirely understands what sovereignty entails. And what's more than that is I don't think that we all understand how that actually applies to us as well. See, there's a tension that exists between sovereignty and community. Every one of us is given a sovereign will. It's part of our creation. It's part of the way that God made us. And in that, he made us a reflection of himself. It was his breath that he breathed into Adam and Eve, into Adam specifically, when he brought Adam into existence. He molded him from the earth, and he breathed into him. We've talked before about there's kind of an essence of God that exists in every human being. As we are made in his image, we're molded and crafted, and a part of him is what gives us life. And in that, there's a lot to that, in the sense of what that means, and I don't think we always look at that. Oftentimes, I think we're generally more preoccupied with, the fact with how we perceive it when we say that I'm nothing without God. We take that to a level that maybe isn't entirely true, almost presuming a place of non-value, as though, until I have God, I hold no value, I hold no personage. I'm just a blank slate, I'm an empty vessel, I'm a living carcass, I'm dead, walking around. And everything that I just said is stuff that I've heard from sermons again and again over the course of years. It's also stuff that isn't entirely true. In the context of what they meant, it had value, but it's the way that it hits the ear, and it's the way that it's perceived by the mass. See, one of the trouble with any kind of message or any kind of public speaking situation is that what you say may not necessarily be what people hear. So even if I sit up here and tell you that, I'm alive in Christ, that doesn't necessarily mean that my statement about how I have found vigor in my existence as I walk with God and live with God, that might not come across as others might perceive it instead as, oh, he was dead before. He was dead before because he didn't have God. He was just a husk. So, the value of each individual is not defined by whether or not they have God. See, God looks at us and sees everything about you. He sees people worth dying for, even before we're saved. We all understand, even from the scriptures, about how Paul, for example, talks about how Jesus died to save us even before we knew him. He died and rose to be the sacrifice for our sins, so that we could be forgiven without even knowing us, without knowing us explicitly. It was all laid out there for him, for us, so that we could be redeemed. And as a result of all that, you know, we tend to become preoccupied by whether or not we have value, and our value exists with or without God. Whereas he's not there. He's very, very much so looking down at people who are broken and suffering and doing things that have nothing to do with him. And he's more than happy to love them and hold them and die for them. That's God's kind of value of mankind. He looks at us and sees a part of himself, no matter where we are. It's why during the spiritual warfare series, it talked about the fact that, like, you know, there's only one enemy of God. And he doesn't look at Satanists and witches and pagans and homosexuals and all these different things that we as Christians have demonized and say those are my enemies. We do that all the time. But he never has. You know, he didn't send the Crusaders into the Holy Land to go kill the Muslims because he defined them as infidel. He didn't create the Ku Klux Klan. You know, he didn't create the indulgences where people could pay the Catholic priests to be allowed certain amounts of sin. None of that was God-breathed. And this ends up being important because when we talk about sovereignty, we can't talk about sovereignty in a church group or in a church in general without acknowledging God's sovereignty and what that means. See, for each of us, we have our own independent will. God has his own independent will. God's will may or may not align with your will. And that can be extremely variable as we move from one topic to the next. Because in one person you might find that, you know, you and God totally agree about taking care of the homeless and the sick, where you both align on the idea that it's, you know, if you have the ability to provide, then provide, help, you know, help take care of people. But when it comes down to, we'll use homosexuality as an example, because that's always been a prevalent one in the church for years. You may not actually align. Maybe you're overly pro-homosexuality. Maybe you're overly against it. Maybe you look at them as being the enemies of God. Or maybe you look at it that God should bend his will in order to, that he should be supplicant to them in some way. And no matter which side of that you're on, that's not God. So he's somewhere else and you're kind of in your place. And you might have scriptures to justify either side. Like we've heard decades of people quoting Paul or quoting different scriptures and saying that, you know, this is the proof that God hates fags. And then you've got other people like Matthew Vines who go through the Bible and come at it saying, you know, this is proof that God accepts homosexuality and there's a place for them in heaven and so on. And the truth of the matter is that neither of those actually have a place in any way, shape, or form yet aligned with God's will and his heart and his mind. So at the end of the day, his sovereignty is not being appreciated or even acknowledged. And this is where we run into a lot of problems. See, God is who he is, and that is all that it is to be said. He has his personality, he has his own character. A lot of us as Christians, we don't let God be God. And a lot of us try to understand him, or we go to other people and try to understand him, and so on. I've been amazed for years, like how many times I'll meet people who legitimately are prophets, who hear from God, and they still don't ask him the most basic of questions about who he is. Because they're not interested in his character or his person. They're not interested in his view or his perspective. They're interested in what he can do for them or what they need to do for him. Because everybody's stuck on this mentality that we have to always be supplicant. There's no relationship. Because we don't, ultimately, one of the problems is we don't view God as a person. And oftentimes there are a lot of doctrines that preach that that's actually a negative thing to do. If you personalize God, then you are doing a disservice to God, and you're sinning in the process because you're trying to make him like man. He made us like him. He literally said, let's make these ones in our own image. I find it baffling and utterly bewildering that we take that stance. And I understand that a lot of people, what they're ultimately having issue with is when we're trying to take God and apply our personality to him. I get that. But there are a lot of people who take it the other way. Again, we go back to that thing about the way what people say versus what's actually perceived. And there are a lot of people who perceive that as, oh, I shouldn't treat God as a person, because if I do that, I'm diminishing him. But at the same time, if you don't do that, you can't appreciate his character, his personality, which are very, very important things, because no relationship that of significance or depth exists without understanding and appreciating the personality of the person in front of you. If I didn't appreciate my wife's personality or her character, I wouldn't be married to her. When I look at my friends, the reasons why I have these friends are because of their personalities and their characters, and how much we get along and we work together and do stuff, and it's fun. But in reality, most of my time with friends involves sitting around and talking to them, because just their personalities and characters are more than enough to be pleased in life. We don't need to go out on some adventure. We can literally just hang out, get a cup of coffee, and talk for hours. And that's more than enough. Because there's a value for character there, for person. So, when we talk about God, there's this reality in which we do need to start viewing him as an individual, as a person. Similar to when we talked about similar again to the spiritual warfare series last year, and talking about how, viewing demons, it's important to view them as persons. Because if you don't, if you view them as collective or spirit or different things like that, you lose a lot of the reality of what it's like to deal with them. Again, they too have their own personalities and characters. The spiritual world is a separate aspect of life. It's another dimension that they live in, that these things exist in, but it's also not completely immaterial. A lot of the same rules still apply, a lot of elements of things. I've heard all kinds of things about how angels don't have personalities, or they don't have souls, how they don't have will. I can remember distinctly having people tell me that angels were creatures that were without their own will, and that's what separated them from what was different between them and human beings. But of course, the whole story of Satan is that he willfully made a decision to go against God. So, do with that as you may. And then a third of the angels joined him in that. So somewhere they did have a will, and they made a choice. And in that choice, they chose to go against God. And even then you bring up that brings up kind of the issue of will existing in the heavenly realms and how that can create imperfection even there in paradise. And that's real. So, and that I say that because that's going to be important a little bit later. So we talk about God's character and his will, his own sovereignty. See, when we talk about sovereignty with God, there's a little bit more than when we talk about sovereignty within ourselves. See, God's sovereignty exists both in terms of his own person and his personal choices, his character, his way, his will, his doing, but it also exists on a far more macroscopic level when we talk about over all the things that he created. Like, one of the problems that we run into as human beings is that God's will does have some specific functions, and when we come down to it, we run into the issue of, like, sin, for example, which the truth of sin ultimately ends up being things that go against God's will for the way that things should be, even if we don't always know. And there's some, like, grace there as far as our own ignorance of what God's will is. But, when we know it, there's a decision that's made. It's the kind of standpoint where if God tells me, hey, I don't want you to say, like, to mock this person, even though they're going to come at you with something that's just brutally ridiculous. Don't mock them. And then if they say their thing and I sit there and say to God, how could I possibly not do this? And then proceed to go with the mocking, I have sinned. Like, that's a soft example, but it's still an example. And this is the thing, is that God sits at a place where, as the creator, as the crafter, as the one who sculpted and molded all of creation, his will and his way matter significantly more, in that he has an ideal that he's set forth. But the truth is that he also has the will to play alongside of our things that we've done and chosen, which he does, and there's scripture for that. Whether we want to talk about, Moses, when God and Moses were talking on the mountain, and God was telling Moses that he was just going to start over with Moses and his family. And Moses pleaded for the Israelites and effectively told God that, if God led them out to the desert and killed them all, then, that would make him look like a monster. That would make him look bad, effectively. God relented and said, you're right. And then he turned around and said, okay, this is the new plan. I've heard many times that people proclaim that God was testing Moses, but that's not actually in the scriptures anywhere. So, unless that's some divine revelation, that's complete apologetics. There's also the story of Hezekiah, which I go to often to talk about it. How with King Hezekiah, God sent the prophet Isaiah there to tell Hezekiah that he was going to die. Set your things in order because you were going to die when he was sick. Hezekiah turned around and wept. And it's implied that he asked God for more time. God stopped Isaiah walking back to his place in the courtyard of the palace, turned him around and had him go tell Hezekiah, you're going to be given so many more years. The thing of it is that when we talk about God's sovereignty, we have to acknowledge that he has his own person, his own character, and his own will, but we also have to acknowledge the fact that he gets to make choices just like we do. And we don't understand that. The truth of the matter is, one of the biggest problems that we're always going to run into with the church is that when we look at the law or different aspects of what the Bible presents, if we are simply projecting an example, an image, an existence of just pure lawfulness onto God, we're going to miss out on the reality of his own character and his ability to make decisions. Sometimes he has to play by our rules because we won't understand it, or we're just going to mess things up too much to not. When David slept with Bathsheba, God could have had under Levitical law, David could have been taken out and stoned for that indiscretion. As king of Israel, there's a specific law, I believe it's in Leviticus, but it might be in Deuteronomy, I'd have to look it back up. But it specifically designates that a king may not have more than one wife. David ended up with more than one wife in that instance. So by all rights, he could have been deposed, he could have been executed, according to the law that he believed in. But God didn't choose to follow that. In fact, there are a lot of instances, even in the Old Testament, where God chose not to follow along with the law of Moses. It's a fascinating little thing to look at, to read through the books of the Kings and to see the stories and how often God does not do what he's supposedly supposed to do, or what's supposedly supposed to be done. How often he shows grace and mercy to people who did things that were objectively evil. I mean, David's story doesn't end like the law says that he could have been executed for that, but then he also committed murder on top of that by setting up the events that revolved around Uriah the Hittite, who was Bathsheba's wife, who he took. Yeah. There was a lot of cause for David to be put into a lot of trouble, and instead God was gracious towards him. To an extent. There was punishment involved, but it wasn't David's life that was lost. So, the thing of it is that we need to understand with God is his own sovereignty, his own character, his own person. When it says sovereign, it means sovereign. And that extends beyond just being a ruler or a leader, which is the noun aspect of that. It means having supreme authority and will, but it means that in the context of not only over all, but of himself. God, Yahweh, Jesus, they are not who you make them out to be. They are who they are. The Holy Spirit is who the Holy Spirit is. It's why we run into so many issues in the church where we'll have like prophets coming and they're legitimately feeling and hearing the Holy Spirit telling them to do something weird. And we tell them, no, that's not from God. Having somebody go up on the stage and sing a song sing a Disney song or something to that effect. I guess I'll give an example, like having God tell me to drive across town or to stop going or not go to work one day because I was supposed to go meet up with a friend who was supposedly having a bad day, who I had no idea was going through this, only to find out that she had so many things going on with her husband and whatnot, and was like feeling like they were on the verge of divorce. But I had a commitment to my job, so I should have stayed there. Somebody might find that questionable, or find reason to see fault in that word and that deed. But at the same time, we're talking about the same God who had a guy marry a prostitute and have kids with her just so he could live out an example of what God's existence was like as it revolved around the people of Israel. Or we talk about, this is the same God who had, I don't remember who it was, who was told to go lay on their side in Ezekiel. Lay on their side for so many days and so many nights, and then turn over and do it again, to make a point. But God's asked people to do some really weird crap in the Bible. Using a Disney song to talk to somebody is hardly within the realm of ungodliness or unrighteousness. At the end of the day, God's going to use the tools at his disposal in order to convey the messages that he needs to convey, in order to show us who he is, in order to better draw us into relationship with him, and relationship with him specifically, with his character, with his person. We hear it described that a lot of our existence, a lot of our relationship, or a lot of our interaction with God is a romance, and that God's trying to woo us and win our hearts. And I've never personally liked that imagery, but it is what it is. But that's what it is, and you can't woo somebody. Well, okay, you can woo somebody with a false personality, but it's gonna come back to bite you when you're like in a marriage and suddenly you're seeing a lot of false stuff, when ultimately the facade kind of wears down and it stops being something that you can maintain. And some people just do it as long as they get the bride, and then they're just like, oh, I can relax this now. I can stop being so charming or so gentle or generous or whatever it is that they're faking. Yeah, God doesn't do that. Like, he presents himself for who he is, and we take that or leave it. We can twist that, for sure. I know a lot of people who do or have. But that doesn't mean that's what he's presenting. There are a lot of times when God will present both the hard and the soft qualities of his person, and we're left to omit whichever side we don't feel comfortable with. There are a lot of people who follow God on the precedence that he is a savage, heartless ruler who demands our obedience, or else. And if we fail to obey him over even the smallest, most microcosmic aspect of our lives, then we will be punished to the full extent of everything that is the law, whether it's Jesus' law or Paul's law or whoever's law, it doesn't matter. And our legalistic mindset takes us to places where God's a monster. On the other hand, you've got people that will admit all of that, and they're just left with the hyper-gracious, ultra-loving, forgive me for everything, will never hold anything against me, I'm not responsible for my own actions, God knows that, and he'll give me grace no matter what. So I can go and do terrible, shameful things. I can cheat on my husband or my wife, and that's okay because God will forgive me, and they have to forgive me too because that's what God's like. We can omit God's character, parts of God's character, but ultimately that's on us when we end up finding out that actually he's not who we made him out to be. Because at the end of the day, when you see God showing himself, like in Deuteronomy, when he shows himself to Moses and says that he is the Lord, gracious, and I'll just find it and read it because I can't remember it well enough to do it justice. It's in Exodus 34, verse 6, starting in verse 6. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the fathers to the third and fourth generation. Both aspects of who he is. He presents that to Moses as he shows up and says, this is who I am. I am these things and these things at the same time. When he shows up in the form of Jesus Christ, when Jesus is going around being who Jesus is, he's rebuking the Pharisees brutally in Matthew 21. And we'll just read a little bit of that to kind of like clarify. Or maybe not 21. 23, that's the one. Where Jesus tears into the Pharisees saying, woe to you, teacher of the law, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You shut the kingdom of heaven in men's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. Woe to you, you travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as you are. Woe to you, blind guides! You say if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath. You blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift on it, he is bound by his oath. You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisees, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then outside. You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of dead men's bones and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. He goes on. But the point is that he talks about, he comes with this kind of fire and just tongue lashing to the Pharisees, flipping the tables over in the temple when they were selling things and defiling God's place of worship. Then at the same time, you have Jesus showing up and healing the sick and the wounded, talking about loving your neighbors as yourself and how that has so much value in it, talking about forgiveness and how you should always be open to forgiveness. You can't take God's character and divide it and think that you're going to understand God, because you're just going to run into things that will always have you doubting in your faith, and your faith will be built on a lie. If I only take the half of the scriptures where Jesus is talking about loving people and showing love, and just ignore all the times when he unloads on the Pharisees or gets frustrated with the disciples, I'm doing a disservice to his character. And what's more is I'm creating a false God. Just the same way as if I dismiss all the good stuff and focus on the negative, scary stuff, where Jesus talks about hell more than heaven and, has strong words about divorce and different things like that. Or says the line, and this is also infamous for people in this side of the bracket, the thing out of Matthew 7, when he's talking about how not all who do things in his name will be saved, and how they'll come saying, look at all the things that I did in your name, and he'll say, I never knew you, be gone from me. That's such an infamous verse for people who stand on that side of this line here, as a scare tactic for themselves to be as close to God as they can be in their own like super hyper obedient legalistic ways. When at the same time you've got John writing in the Spirit that love casts out all fear, because fear has to do with punishment. It's in 1 John 4. So when we talk about sovereignty with God, we need to take it as a whole. We need to take God's character as a whole and recognize that he is his own person with his own character. And he's not going to do everything that you want him to do. And sometimes that's really hard. Because sometimes you have things that you really need done, and you really want done, and you think are going to be the best, and he's not doing it. Like, I'll just put this forward as a really hard example as, my wife's been sick for 2 years, off and on. And there are so many times when I've woken up next to her and just put a hand on her shoulder and begged God to heal her of whatever sickness was going on at that time. And at the end of the day, there are times when I have struggled with hope. The whole idea that I'm supposed to keep putting faith into this being who supposedly wants the best for us, but at the same time, I'm begging for him to heal my wife, and he's not doing it. Or at least he's not doing it the way that I think it should be done. That's a hard one to navigate when we talk about just the emotional and even the way that we perceive God's character in person. So, and the reality of it is the thing that I've had to face is kind of what we'll talk about shortly here. But it's this whole thing of like where my heart and intentions really are, and just having to be honest with those and what they are looking like. Because sovereignty is a thing that we carry, and in that can be a really great thing, that can also be a really dark thing. Because maybe we're not the ones who have the fullest understanding of the world and everything around it, and as a result of that, maybe we also don't always have the discernment to navigate having free will. But we have it, so we have to learn that. So when it comes down to that, there are a lot of things that I've wanted God to do for me that, even though they seem like very important, and they are very important and very good, maybe my heart wasn't in the right place. And I don't say maybe because it's possible. I say maybe because it wasn't in the right place. So, at the end of the day, when one example that we've talked about was when Jesus had the Pharisees coming up to him and telling him that they wanted him to perform miracles, because they did this all the time. There are several different examples in the Gospels where the Pharisees came up and said, prove to us that you're the Son of Man. Prove it. And the thing of it was that, with respect to them, we always kind of there's a prevalent thing in the church where we sit back and look down on the Pharisees. And the fact that, how did they not believe in Jesus? I can't tell you how many times I've sat in men's groups or Bible studies where everybody just scoffs at them and their foolishness. At the same time, when somebody comes up saying that they pray and people are healed, they do the same thing. Prove that you can do this, otherwise you're a liar. So we don't really have faith in those kinds of things. And some of it's because we've had lots of people come up and lie about that stuff. Some of it's also because some of us don't really believe in God. And I'm not talking about individuals in the room, I'm talking about the church at large. So the point is, though, is that when Jesus was met with that thing, he didn't do it for them. He didn't say, okay, here, I'll prove myself to you. Now this blind person sees. Hurrah. Instead, he either rebuked them and walked away or just walked away. But he didn't do those things for them. I've said this line before, that God won't dance for you. And I say that, when I say that, it's a particular kind of gruff statement. It sets a tone. It's almost like you're asking God to dance for you. And the truth is that the point is that we're trying to get God to perform, to meet our needs or wants. And even if perform is too specific a word, you could say instead that we're trying to get him to show himself to us, to show up for us, to be there. But at the end of the day, we're trying to get him to do that. The perform, show up, whatever collection of words you want to throw into that space doesn't matter as much as the we're trying to make him do this. That part is a problem. At any point in time when we have people, and specifically when we're talking about our individual relationships and we talk about the nature of that, anytime that we try to make somebody do something, that is what?
Manipulation.
Exactly. That is definably manipulation. God's not going to be manipulated. Even if your heart's in the right place, if your actions are not, if your intention, if your kind of motivation is not, he's not going to meet that. All right. So one of the biggest things here is, we've talked about God's sovereignty and about his person. But I also mentioned several times about our sovereignty and about how as human beings, made in his image, carrying his breath, we have sovereignty. In fact, one kind of fascinating little tidbit of information is in the Hebrew language, when the word judge is used. Like, I can't remember exactly what it is now, but it's the same word that they use for God, for angels, and for judges. But it's all the same word, because they don't see the difference between them.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I don't remember this one.
Yeah. And even then, you find other instances. There's this one really obscure... Elohim.
Yeah.
Elohim is the word. Yes. Another interesting one is when you read this, there's one story in the Gospels where Jesus presents this kind of obscure statement where he talks about the God to my God honoring a God, and I wish I could remember where it's at, but I don't.
Oh, it's like in John, I think.
Yeah.
Where they're like, I think they're coming at him because he just said God was his father.
Right.
And then he's just like, well, isn't it in the Psalms, you are God's?
Yeah. He's talking about David specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And he's just like, your God saying to my God that he's God. And, it's this kind of obscure. It can seem a little obscure, but there's a point that he's getting to. But he also, at the same time, honors the sovereignty of David in that statement. The thing about it is that when we talk about our individual sovereignty, we buck up against a couple of different issues. Number one, our finite perception and capacity. The other part is the fact that in this earth, in this planet, we're not just our own beings. Like, usually what we run into when we talk about sovereignty and community is that there's a tension that we have to live in. Understanding and appreciating that, you know, even though I have sovereign will, I can make my own decisions in my life, I am going to affect other people. And it's even something that's talked about in Scripture in John 17 when Jesus prays to God for us, for the disciples, and for the people. He prays for unity, for greater unity, and he actually references the fact that we are so much more connected to each other than we realize. Because the thing that we do is that we don't exist in the tension, we exist on one of the two extremes. We either live a life that's where we celebrate our sovereignty, our free will. We basically live as being very selfish or self-absorbed. Or we exist more on the community part of it, where we'll basically do anything for acceptance, and we basically let the world around us change, or the people around us change us, and we try to be more interwoven into the tissue of this collective being. And neither of those are entirely acceptable. Like, there are times where you need to be selfish even though community is important, and there are times where you need to delve into community even though you want to do things for yourself. It's why it's a tension. There's a give and a take, and it's difficult to navigate. So, as individual human beings, we have our own sovereign will, and we have that. But we are very connected. But that doesn't change the fact that we have that will. And the thing of it is that as individuals, we all get to make decisions. I mean, we literally decide whether we're going to draw close to God or not, whether we're going to create whole worlds and religions and different things. We build worlds and towns and cities and villages and cultures and all these different aspects of life. We make music. And art, and we build little machines that emulate us. Just as God created us, we create things in our own image. Okay. You know, that's the thing, and
They're probably like
yeah, probably. Anyway, in that same vein, we emulate God in that way, where he looked at us and said, let's create something in our own image. We do the same thing as we create things in our own image. I mean, and it doesn't have a filter here. Whether it's art that we perform or develop, or it's even the gods we choose. I always remember a story coming out of, I believe it was Japan, but they were talking about the Buddhists there and how they would choose the Buddha statues that reminded them of themselves. And often, huh? Well, you know, doing different hobbies or things like that. People choose patron saints. There are many people who choose aspects of different gods and religions that they like and create their own kind of belief system. That's something that we do, we can do, because it's part of that will, that sovereignty, that ability. We can make ourselves our own gods. And there are people that'll take that to the extreme and create cults around themselves and things like that. We have the capacity to be followers and gods in our own right, in our own ways. That's not something you necessarily find anywhere else on this planet. It's only people. As of yet. The thing of it is that our sovereignty grants us exceptional power and authority in our existence, in our realm. And that's really important for us to remember. Basically, your choices have weight and they matter. And how you live your life has weight and it matters. The trouble is that we also have that connectedness. So sometimes how you live your life and the weight of those choices not only matters for you, but it matters for the people around you. And sometimes their decisions matter for you and have weight for you. See, the thing of it is that, you know, like I said earlier, maybe we don't necessarily always have the discernment to navigate this tension, because we have a lot of power to create, destroy. Oftentimes we put ourselves in a seat of judgment that determines, you know, what is right and wrong. Deer don't run up to God and tell him that he's wrong for saying that something is a sin when we see no problem with it. Tigers don't justify themselves before God for their pride, you know. We do, though. We'll stand up and tell God that he's wrong. And we're allowed to do that. And he doesn't strike us down for that, because that's part of us existing within that will, which is something that he loves about us. He created it, that. Like, he gave us that when he gave us his breath. He values how much we can do, even giving us more power and authority through his spirit when we're, you know, we don't even have to be aligned to him entirely. You got stories of the sons of Sceva running around casting out demons in his name.
That'll take us to the fire pit.
They chased away malicious spirits by simply uttering God's name. And he honored that. They were allowed to function in that.
Okay, let's go.
You know, until the one demon that was particularly strong stood up and wrestled them down and took their clothes. But the point is that to a point they had that going for them. On the one hand, there's something to be incredibly valued about this. There's what we can do with our own will and freedom. And there's so much. There's so much possibility. There's so much of a world to go out and be involved in. And there's so much that we can do and be. But that's a double-edged sword. Because at the end of the day, we run into this struggle of perception and that connected element where what we can do sometimes is a direct product of what's been done to us. I've seen, you know, sometimes we end up becoming a product of our own culture, or sometimes we become a product of our own abuses. I know bullies I know people who were bullied who act like bullies because this is what they were put through, this is what they were raised with, this is what was projected onto them, and it became a part of their person, and they don't even see it themselves. They just do it. I've seen people who spent time being gaslighted for years, I've seen them become gaslighters. They don't mean to, they don't know they're doing it, they don't move forward trying to be that, yet they are because it's been so ingrained in them. And this is what I mean when sometimes we are the product of what other people's will has done. We can become, sometimes without really being aware of it, we can become kind of indoctrinated with the values and ideals of people who are hurt and hurting others. And there is this whole kind of process that can happen as it spreads like a cancer. And that's one of the great big struggles with the power and authority that we have, is we can be really injured and then act out of that injury and then propagate a culture of that injury. It's why it's a dangerous thing as much as something to be celebrated. It's beautiful and destructive, creative and beneficial, but also detrimental all at once, depending on what we do with it and where we go with it. And I don't really think, and the other side of this is when we interact with God, sometimes our will and our way can come into direct contrast with him. And I don't mean like in terms of what we've already talked about with us saying, you know, he's wrong about things. What I mean is even how we interact with him. Because sometimes I don't think we're always completely cognizant of the way that we interact with the people around us. I don't think that we're always completely honest with how we talk to each other. Because the important thing is that we go back to that statement of, you know, trying to make God do this thing, like show up or do whatever, and how that was the important part. We do that all the time with ourselves, with each other. There are so many occasions where on a day-to-day basis, we are unintentionally or subconsciously manipulative, pushy, petty, self-righteous. Like, there are so many little things that are so ingrained into our everyday that we don't even realize that we're doing it. I've seen a lot of people who are like, what was the term? Husband training. I remember talking to women who were specifically like taught by their mothers that the most important thing to do after you're married is train your husband. And they believed that that was a normal thing, that was completely valid. Like a dog.
Did it work?
But they didn't get married for long.
Well,
Some of
yeah.
them did. And they ended up
It's
with
not
husbands
pet.
that were not happy. The point is that, like, you know, sometimes our culture can mess us up in such a way that we move forward in ways and things that are patterns that are actually quite destructive. And even when we're trying to interact with God, I know for myself, like, just to use myself as an example here, to kind of highlight what I'm saying, is that I was raised to be very manipulative. And there's a lot of stuff that I was taught, like, not intentionally, by, like, my mom specifically, where, like, a lot of her interactions were very manipulative. She would try to find what she could use out of people. She still does this on occasion. She looks for, well, anyway, the point is that for myself,
Most of it.
true. For myself, I found myself being that same kind of person and moving about things the same way. And even to the point of my interactions with God, up into a point, like I would try to coerce him to do what I wanted, one way or another. Whether it was through trying to guilt trip him, trying to manipulate his emotions, and in the process trying to manipulate my own emotions, trying to say that I'm not trying to get him to prove himself. I just want him to, I just want him to do what he's supposed to do, or to be who he's supposed to be, or, this is important for this person, or whatever. Even though, like, the bigger thing was that I wanted him to prove that he existed, or that he was real, or that he cared. And that was the thing, is like, I couldn't see that until I was able to have some time to really process it and step back and look at it. So that's what I mean when I say that whole thing. I don't think we're always completely aware of how we're interacting with God, and in the same way how we're interacting with each other. I think that a lot of us have, and I don't mean just like us in this group, I mean a lot of people in general, have some really dangerous and negative patterns in the way that they affect one another and communicate with one another. And even the way that we see one another, because maybe a lot of us don't see another person when we look at each other. A lot of us see objects depending on whether or not we align with each other. And that's something that comes with that freedom of will, that sovereignty, is I don't have to treat anybody else like another person. I can be an absolute jerk as much as I want to be. I've done it. I've been that guy where everyone was just like fun little fodder for me to dick around with as much as I wanted to, and make them dance because it was funny. There are people who function that way. And I'm not talking about like sociopaths and psychopaths. They're just people that are hurt and don't care. And I think that ends up being the thing that we have to really navigate here, because when we talk about God's person and character, right, there's a navigation of who he is. And when we talk about ourselves and our person and character, there's that same navigation of who we are. What we do is significant. Our choices, our words are significant. Especially when it comes to how we impact the people in the world around us. Because we don't have the benefit of being as much of like an isolated element as we like to pretend we are. Or, if we're too far into the connectedness level, we can become enablers where we're allowing other people to do the same terrible things as those other ones who are like off on their own. But we need to know who we are. If we're going to be sovereign beings, if we're creatures bestowed with significant power and authority in and of ourselves, that can and will affect people around us just as much as we do our own thing and get what we want or whatever, we have to find out who we are. And as followers of Jesus, we also need to consider and value who God is and how our interactions with him look. There are plenty of people who say they love God, but in reality they really like God because they can try to use him. And when we talk about the aspects of the way that a lot of the church looks at the Bible and creates an idea of who he is based on that, they look at attributes, they look at events, they look at stories and different things like that, but they don't look at his character or person. It's because if we can quantify him and fit him into a box, then we can predict what he's going to do. The Bible describes God as being like a, what was the term? It's in Hebrews. He's like an all-consuming fire. Like, in Portland, or in Oregon, not long ago, we learned what an all-consuming fire does. It just burns, and it's not entirely predictable. It ate up most of the Columbia River Gorge. And then when we thought we were getting it under control, it jumped over the river onto the Washington side. That's not a small distance. It's pretty crazy that a spark or an ember made it that far. You can't predict or control that. And in that same way, understanding sovereignty is understanding absolute control of and authority left to an individual. And if we can't control, we understand that we can't really control each other. Like, we can do all kinds of things, manipulate, brainwash, terrible, terrible things, and those are unacceptable. But we can do them and try to gain some semblance of control over another person. But it's never complete. You have to keep doing it. You have to break them down, and even then you don't really get that person, you get some shell. The same is true with God. We can't really control him. And the point of talking about sovereignty is, one, to appreciate and value the nature of what this is, but also more than that, to stop trying to control the people and especially God around us. And also to just be more honest with ourselves. About maybe the way that we do go about interacting. If I'm somebody that's trying to use the Bible to get God to do what I want, I'm doing it wrong, and I'm not appreciating his sovereignty in the same way that if I'm the kind of person who's browbeating somebody to try to get them to do what I want, again, I'm not really appreciating their sovereignty and their will. And we all understand the nuances of interactions with people, and like that there are times where sometimes somebody needs that swift hand to the back of the skull to get them moving or to get them to get it. But we also appreciate that sometimes they don't, and that's unacceptable to do that. There's a lot of give and take, and there's a lot of complication when we try to interact with people and understand people. But probably a very solid beginning point is to appreciate that they are who they are, and they get to be who they are. And if God himself values that, then maybe we should too. And not only for them, but also for ourselves. And while in being Christians, there is a process of drawing closer to God and becoming more like him, we also have to be able to, one, recognize who we are, repent of the things where we're willing to sin, but also we have to know him in order to be more like him, you know? Like, we can pray and ask God to make us more like him, and, you know, he may do that. I know that from experience too. But we have to go from a starting point of recognizing who he is, being able to recognize who he is. Otherwise, we'll never know if we're becoming more like him, will we? So, that's what I've got.